We're diving deep today into how to prioritize those all-important test cases.
Absolutely.
You've all been sharing some really insightful thoughts on the pressures of software testing these days, and it really does seem to boil down to this one question.
Yeah.
With the clock ticking and resources always finite, how do you make absolutely sure that you're testing what truly matters?
Right.
So that's our mission today.
Okay.
We're going to equip you with the strategies you need to test smarter, not harder.
Love it.
Because in today's world of, rapid development cycles, trying to test every single possibility.
It's impossible.
Well, it's not impossible.
Yeah.
It's just such a drain on your time and resources.
Right.
So effective prioritization, that's your secret weapon.
Okay.
It's your shortcut to making sure that you're hitting that quality where it counts the most and helping you to balance risk efficiency and ultimately your business goals.
Absolutely.
So over the next little while, we're going to unpack exactly why this prioritization is so crucial for you. We'll look at the key factors that should be front of mind when you're deciding what to test.
Love it.
And most importantly, we're going to arm you with some concrete techniques that you can put into practice right away.
Perfect.
So let's start with the why.
Yeah.
Why is test case prioritization so vital in the first place?
Well, you can't test everything.
Yeah.
That's the reality.
Yeah.
There's always limited time before you have to get a release out the door, and the cost of trying to cover every single test scenario.
Astronomical.
It really is astronomical. And plus, requirements shift projects. The scope of the project changes. It's a moving target.
Right.
So trying to chase every possibility, you're going to burn out. And ironically, you might not even end up with the quality where it matters most.
It's like trying to boil the ocean.
Exactly.
You can't do it.
Yeah.
So what's the real danger there?
The critical risk is that without a clear prioritization strategy, you're gambling. You run the risk of missing those critical defects.
All right.
The ones that truly impact your users, maybe even cripple the core functionality of your app or really damage the business's reputation.
Right.
You might be diligently testing some obscure corner case while a show-stopping bug in your most popular feature slips through the net.
Oh, that's the nightmare scenario, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. So what's the flip side? What's the core benefit that we're aiming for with prioritization?
Focus.
Okay.
By prioritizing, you ensure that the most important tests get done first.
Right.
You directly minimize the risk of those high-impact defects making their way into the hands of your users.
Right.
You're maximizing the value of your testing efforts by concentrating on the areas that give you the biggest bang for your buck in terms of quality, risk reduction, and, just overall success.
It makes total sense.
Yeah.
It reminds me of, packing for a trip.
Okay.
You've got limited luggage space. You're going to prioritize the absolute essentials. Your passport, your tickets, clothes.
For sure.
Before you even think about throwing in those extra books or souvenirs you might pick up.
Yeah.
Testing is the same.
It is.
You've got to focus on the must-haves first.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
It really highlights the idea of focusing on what's essential for the journey. And in this case, it's the successful release and use of the software.
Right.
So we understand why it matters.
Yeah.
Let's talk about
Right.
what are the key factors that we need to consider when we're trying to decide what to test first?
Okay, so this first one seems pretty obvious.
Yeah.
But it's fundamental.
It is.
Business impact.
Right?
If a feature is absolutely mission critical to the business's success,
Yes.
think, revenue generation, core services. It's got to be a top priority for testing.
Absolutely.
Right.
For sure.
So give me an example.
Well, think about an e-commerce application.
Okay.
While ensuring that the user interface is, pixel perfect on every page is important.
Sure.
It's not as important as a flawlessly functioning payment processing system.
Right. If customers can't pay.
Yeah. If customers can't pay, the business stops.
The business grinds to a halt.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So number 2 on our list is risk and probability of failure.
Yes.
And this one feels like it has a couple of layers to it.
It does.
So break it down for me.
Certain areas of an application are just inherently riskier than others.
Okay.
Think about sections with complex logic, maybe intricate security protocols or integrations with other systems.
Okay.
These are often more prone to failure.
Right.
And can have significant consequences if they do fail.
Can you make that a little bit more concrete for me?
Sure.
Give me an example.
Let's say you're implementing a new database migration.
Okay.
This is a complex operation with the potential for data loss or corruption.
Right.
The probability of something going wrong there is arguably higher than, say, a minor change to the color scheme of a button.
Right.
So test cases designed to validate the success of that database migration need to be at the top of the priority list.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So what about number 3?
Number 3 is frequency of use.
Okay.
And it's from the perspective of your users.
Okay.
So think about the features that your customers interact with day in and day out.
Right.
Those are the touch points that are most visible and where issues will have the most immediate and widespread impact on user satisfaction.
So we're talking login screens, search functionality.
Yes.
The core workflows that users rely on constantly.
Exactly.
Right.
Pretty much every application, whether it's a social media platform or a productivity tool, the login process is the gateway.
Right.
If they can't log in, nothing else matters.
Right.
Similarly, if a search function is central to how users find information, its reliability is paramount.
And in e-commerce, of course, the checkout flow.
The checkout flow is critical.
Okay.
You need rigorous testing on these features to ensure a smooth user experience.
Okay, so moving right along, we have regulatory or compliance requirements.
Yes.
This sounds like something you absolutely cannot afford to get wrong.
You can't.
So tell me about it.
If your software operates in industries or regions that have specific legal or compliance mandates,
Okay.
things like GDPR for data privacy in Europe, or HIPAA for healthcare information in the U.S., any tests related to those regulations become critical priorities.
Yeah.
Because failure to comply can result in hefty fines.
Huge fine.
And legal repercussions.
Absolutely.
So you need to ask yourself, are you fully aware of all the regulations that apply to the software you're testing?
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
Okay, what about looking backwards a little bit?
Yeah.
Our next factor is past defect history.
Yes, this is where your historical data becomes really valuable.
Okay.
Features or modules that have been a consistent source of bugs in previous releases are likely to cause trouble again.
Right.
So your past defect history is a strong indicator of future problems.
So if we've had endless issues with login functionality and session management in the past, you're going to be focusing your testing efforts there in subsequent cycles.
Right. If an area has a track record of instability, it needs extra attention.
Yeah.
Prioritize test cases that target the functionalities where defects have frequently occurred.
This is all making so much sense to me.
Yeah.
You know, it reminds me of another analogy.
Okay.
Think about testing a car.
Yeah.
We talked about brakes being critical.
Right.
But you'd also prioritize things like the engine, steering,
Of course.
the core functions that make that car operate safely and effectively.
For sure.
You know, you might check the windshield wipers, but they're not in the same league of importance
So they're not?
for overall functionality and safety.
Exactly.
So we've covered the what.
Yes.
Now let's get down to the how.
Okay.
What are some techniques we can use to put these prioritization ideas into practice?
All right, let's talk about some techniques.
Okay.
The first one is risk-based testing,
Okay.
or RBT for short.
Okay. Arbitra.
This technique focuses on the areas of your software that carry the highest risk.
So it aligns with one of the key factors that we just talked about.
It does.
Okay.
The idea here is to focus your testing efforts where the potential for failure is the greatest and the impact of failure is the most significant.
Okay. So how do we actually put this into practice?
It's a pretty straightforward process.
Okay.
First, you need to identify those high-risk areas.
Okay.
This usually involves analyzing the complexity of the code, looking at past defect history, and considering what would happen if a particular feature failed.
Right.
Once you've identified those areas, you assign priority levels to your test cases.
Okay.
Usually something like high, medium, low, based on the assessed risk.
Got it.
And then finally, and this is important, you execute the high-risk tests first.
Okay. So let's take that banking app as an example again.
Sure.
If the fund transfer feature has had a history of security vulnerabilities
Right.
and involves complex transaction logic, using RBT, we would identify this as a high-risk area. So test cases focusing on the security and integrity of fund transfers.
Yeah.
They'd be assigned a high priority.
Correct.
And they'd be among the first tests to be executed.
Exactly.
Makes a lot of sense.
Okay, what's the next technique?
Okay, next up we have business critical testing.
Yes.
So tell me about this one.
This approach really focuses in on what matters most to the stakeholders and the end users.
Okay.
It's about prioritizing your testing efforts around the core business functionalities.
The things that really make the business tick.
Yes, the things that drive revenue, support critical operations, or are just essential for customer use.
So the first step here would be figuring out what those core business functionalities are.
Absolutely.
Right.
You need to work with stakeholders, product owners, maybe even look at user behavior to identify the must-haves for the business to function.
Okay.
Once you've done that, you can then prioritize your test cases based on their direct impact on revenue generation or how critically customers rely on them.
Okay, can you give me an example of that in action?
Sure.
Okay.
Think about an online travel booking website.
All right.
Features like user profile management or viewing past booking history are important.
Sure.
But the core business is letting people search for flights and book them.
Right.
So test cases that cover that search functionality, the booking engine, the payment gateway, those are considered business critical.
Okay.
And they would take precedence over testing the ability to update frequent flyer details.
Got to focus on the features that let the business operate.
Exactly.
And generate value.
That's right.
Okay, next up we have the Pareto principle.
Yes.
Or, as it's more commonly known, the 80-20 rule.
Right.
I've heard this one applied in so many different contexts.
It's a popular one.
So how does it relate to test prioritization?
The Pareto principle suggests that roughly 80% of effects come from 20% of the causes. In software testing, that often translates to around 80% of defects coming from about 20% of the features.
Okay, so how do we actually use this 80-20 rule to prioritize our testing?
Well, the first step is to analyze your historical defect data.
Okay.
Look back at past projects' releases and see where most of the bugs were found.
Right.
Once you've pinpointed those recurring problem areas, that critical 20%, you concentrate your testing efforts on the test cases that cover those features.
So it's almost like predicting the future.
It is a little bit.
Based on past experience.
Exactly. If you know your mobile app has a history of crashing during login,
right,
the Pareto principle would suggest you prioritize your testing efforts on all aspects of the login functionality.
Makes a lot of sense.
So the different login methods, error handling, session management, all of that, rather than spreading your testing equally across all the less frequently used parts of the app.
Really practical.
It is.
Okay, so what's next?
Next, we have customer-focused prioritization. This one really puts the user experience front and center.
Okay.
It emphasizes testing the areas of your software that have the biggest impact on your users.
Both positive and negative, I imagine.
Correct.
So how do we know which areas those are?
The key is to gather feedback directly from your users.
Right.
And analyze usage analytics. Look for patterns in user complaints, bug reports, support tickets, even social media feedback.
Right.
Analytics tools can also provide insight into which features are most heavily used.
Sure.
And where users might be encountering difficulties.
Right.
And once you have that information, you prioritize test cases that cover the features that are generating the most negative feedback.
Give me an example.
Okay, imagine a social media application where users consistently report slow loading times for images.
Okay.
Even though those image-related features might not be the core revenue drivers,
right,
the negative impact on the user experience is significant.
It is, yeah.
So in that case, customer-focused prioritization would say you should prioritize performance tests specifically related to image loading and display.
Right.
And potentially even over-testing new features that haven't yet generated any feedback.
Yeah, a poor user experience can really just cause users to abandon an application altogether.
Absolutely.
All right, last but not least, we have regression testing prioritization.
Yes.
This sounds particularly important in agile environments where code changes happen frequently.
It is very important in that environment.
So tell me about this one.
Regression testing is all about making sure that your recent code changes haven't broken existing functionality.
Okay.
And regression testing prioritization takes that idea a step further by focusing your efforts on the areas of the software that are most likely to be affected by those modifications.
So we need to figure out what parts of the application have been touched by those recent changes.
Yes, exactly. You need to identify the modules, components, features that have been modified or are close to the changed code. Then you prioritize your regression test cases based on the dependencies between those areas and the potential impact of those changes.
So give me a real-world example of that.
Sure. Let's say a new search algorithm has been implemented.
Okay.
Regression testing prioritization would mean that you first focus on the functionality of the search feature itself,
right,
making sure that it still works as expected and that the new algorithm hasn't caused any problems. You might also want to prioritize regression tests for any features that directly rely on that search functionality.
Right.
You can hold off on running tests on unrelated parts of the application until you're confident that the core changes haven't introduced any major regressions.
These are really valuable techniques.
They are.
And I can see how using a combination of them could be super powerful.
Absolutely.
So now, are there any tools out there that can actually help us put this all into practice?
Yes. Thankfully, there are.
Okay, good.
Several categories of tools that can help.
Great.
First, you have your test management tools.
Okay.
Things like Jira with plugins like X-Ray or dedicated tools like TestRail and Zephyr.
Yeah.
These will often let you assign priorities to test cases.
Okay.
Track risk levels and even link tests to requirements.
Right.
It just makes it easier to see the big picture.
That's great. And what about tools specifically for risk analysis?
There are some great tools for that too,
right,
like risk storming or even dedicated features within test management tools, like we said, X-Ray,
right,
that can help you identify and assess risks associated with different parts of your application.
And for teams that are practicing CI/CD, are there tools that can help automate this prioritization?
For sure.
Okay.
Lots of CI/CD tools like Jenkins, Azure DevOps, and GitHub Actions have features that allow you to automate the execution of those high priority test cases early in your development pipeline.
Okay.
So you'll know right away if you've introduced a major regression.
And that can be a huge time saver.
It can be.
Okay, so finally, for understanding that user perspective, are there any tools that can help us there?
There are analytics tools.
Okay.
Like Google Analytics and user behavior analysis tools like Hotjar.
Right.
They can provide data on which features are being used, where users are encountering problems, and just generally how users are interacting with the application.
Right.
So that data is invaluable for that customer-focused prioritization.
That's great. So it sounds like there are tons of tools out there to support this.
There are.
Do you have any final practical tips for leveraging these tools?
I do. A key practical tip in a CI/CD environment is to automate the execution of your highest priority test cases very early in the development lifecycle. Run those tests with every code change and get immediate feedback on those critical areas.
That's great advice.
Okay,
so we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
What's the core message that you really want everyone to take away from this deep dive?
Effective test case prioritization is not about doing less testing.
Right.
It's about smarter testing.
Yeah.
It leads to faster release cycles because you're not wasting time on low-impact tests.
Right.
And ultimately, it results in higher quality software because you're focusing on what matters most.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And just to recap some of the key takeaways for our listeners.
Yeah.
Remember how important it is to focus your testing on the features that are business critical, carry high risk of failure, and are used frequently by your users.
Absolutely.
And remember those prioritization techniques that we discussed. RBT, business impact analysis, the Pareto principle.
They're all powerful tools.
And don't forget about using those test management tools and automation to really streamline this whole process.
You'll be much more in control once you have a solid prioritization strategy in place.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
Well, this has been super insightful.
Glad to hear it.
And to all of you listening, I have one final thought for you. As you go back to work, start thinking about how you can actually apply these prioritization techniques.
Yeah.
Look at your existing test cases. Rank them based on their potential impact and the risk.
Good idea.
Ask yourself, what's one area where smarter test prioritization could have the biggest impact right now?
That's a great question.
Thanks for joining our deep dive.
Thanks for having me.